Is Donald Trump a fascist? For many, that is a key question this election. The term is notoriously hard to define. The most prominent example is, of course, Nazi Germany, and rightfully so, but it is far from the only example. It is certainly not exclusive to members of the Axis powers during World War II. For example, the dictators Francisco Franco and Antonio Salazar of Spain and Portugal fit the bill. It's also far from just being a European phenomenon. Many of the military juntas that popped up in Latin America during the 60s and 70s could rightfully be described as fascist. It's also an ideology that can take on very distinct flavors depending on where it is in the world, such as Uganda under Idi Amin, Japan under Hirohito, or Iraq under Saddam Hussein. There are important differences between each of these regimes, but they could all arguably fall under the fascist umbrella. But the question many are asking today is, does Donald Trump fit under that fascist umbrella? When attempting to define fascism, I think it's best to look at the characteristics that are most commonly met, such as hypernationalism, or more specifically, a national supremacy that normally contains an ethnic supremacy, but I would argue that's not a necessary component. But that supremacist agenda is almost always pursued at the expense of surrounding nations or ethnicities. That leads to the next characteristic, hyper-militarism. Fascist regimes almost always engage in some sort of military aggression against their neighbors. Another important characteristic would be a cult of personality that almost always manifests in a dictatorial regime. A strongman leader, very often with a military background, that is keen on maintaining a strict hierarchical system. One that crushes dissent. Now that's an important aspect. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression, those are antithetical to fascism. The final characteristic I want to touch on is a virulent anti-communism. Now obviously there are many people who are against communism, such as myself, who are not fascists, but being very vehemently anti-communist does tend to be a key principle in many fascist ideologies. Now I'm sure many of you watching are thinking everything I just described fits with Trump. I would argue, though, Trump is not a fascist. My two main reasons are A, I don't think Trump is ideological enough to be a fascist. I don't think he believes much of anything politically. And B, I think scale and degree are really important when we're saying whether or not something is fascist. While Trump does to a degree meet many of those characteristics, I would argue he does not cross the extreme threshold for those characteristics necessary to be called a fascist. Now, there are definitely some figures around Trump I would argue meet that threshold. And I do think something the Trump movement has shown us is how susceptible American society is to fascism. But I do not think Trump himself meets the bill. I still think he's horrible. I definitely don't want him to win, but I don't think he's a fascist.